In our investigation of the collapse of towers 1 and 2, loss of strength and stiffness was more important. For World Trade Center 7, thermal expansion was a critical factor. These effects occur at temperatures much lower than those required to reduce steel strength and stiffness. These two posters show why thermal expansion was so important for the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Here is a layout of the columns in the building. You see that on the east side of the building, these long span floor beams are connected to a girder here and here, but there are no opposing support beams. Now, if you look at this poster, you can see the kinds of effects we're talking about by thermal expansion. You have here the exterior wall of the building, which is pretty rigid, and the floor system, which is a steel, concrete, composite floor system, expands due to heat. Fires might be under the floor system and as well as on the top of the floor. And as the expansion occurs, steel expands more than the concrete, and you can see the beams pushing out. But before these beams can actually push out, the connection between the concrete and the steel has to break. The composite action has to be lost. And that happens when the shear studs that connect the concrete and the steel actually fail. Steel expands in a much more greater magnitude than does concrete when you heat it up. So, as a result of that, you have failures between the steel and the concrete, but you also have three additional effects. One, you could have beams that are here that are restrained from expanding, prevented from expanding because of this column here, for example, and that can buckle. And you see an example of a buckled beam right here. You can have another situation where the beams actually are free to expand and push this major girder connecting these two columns and actually cause this girder to buckle. And the third thing that can happen is as this girder is pushed by the beams, it can break the connections with the column. So there are three effects that can happen as a result of thermal expansion. So in summary, the exterior columns of the building were more closely spaced than the interior ones. When fires heated the floor system, thermal expansion of the floor beams caused damage to connections between the steel beams and the concrete slab of the composite floor system. Some of the beams buckled. Others pushed the girders, causing some of them to buckle. A few girders lost their connections to columns, triggering floor failures. Fires on floors 7 through 9 and 11 through 13 were particularly severe. Long-span steel beams on the lower floors of the east side of the building expanded significantly due to these fires, damaging the floor framing on multiple floors. Eventually, a girder on floor 13 lost its connection to a critical interior column that provided support for the long girder, and the displaced girder and other local fire-induced damage caused floor 13 to collapse. So this was the girder that failed, connecting column 79 to column 44. This began a cascading chain of failures of 8 additional floors, many of which already had been at least partially weakened by the fires in the vicinity of the critical column. With the support of these floors gone, we now had column 79 unsupported over multiple floors, and it buckled, which initiated the fire-induced progressive collapse of the building. Here's a close-up from the structural computer model we developed to show how the floor failures led to an unsupported column on the far right, and then buckling of that column. And you can see on the screen the column at the very right is column 79. and that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining columns. This in turn caused the failure of nearby columns 80 and 81 and floor failures up to the roof line. These images show how the failure of column 79 matches up with a still frame from a video of the event. As the building starts to fall in the video, which I will show shortly, a kink occurs at the top of the building as the east penthouse falls. At the same time, the video shows windows breaking on the east side of the building. When you overlay the layout of the penthouse with the diagram of the building floor framing, you can see how the girders between columns 79, 80, and 81 line up with the kink seen in the penthouse. In fact, all three columns, 79, 80, and 81, and the red line are pretty much in the same direction. As the roof line begins to fall, adjacent columns buckle as well. And we're talking about these adjacent 79, 80, and then what happens is you start seeing columns break from left to right. Here's a video taken on 9/11 that shows WTC 7 collapsing. Note the kink in the east penthouse and the progression of the screening wall and the west penthouse collapsing from east to west. Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event. World Trade Center 7 was designed generally consistent with the applicable New York City building code during its construction. If water had been available, it is likely that the sprinklers would have operated and the building may still have been standing here today. The estimated 4,000 occupants of World Trade Center 7 on 9/11 evacuated without loss of life and any serious injuries. In general, tall buildings are very safe. We have decades upon decades of real-life experience to prove this. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 on 9/11 was a rare event. Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse. In the building community, the term progressive collapse means the spread of local damage from a single initiating event from structural element to structural element, eventually resulting in the collapse of an entire structure or a disproportionately large part of it. Currently, thermal expansion effects are not explicitly considered in current design practice for fire resistance ratings. And no design professional is assigned the responsibility for adequately ensuring the adequate fire safety performance of the structural system in a fire. Architects typically use catalog test data to specify fireproofing thickness to meet the fire ratings in the building code. Structural engineers design buildings to withstand its weight and to resist earthquake and wind loads, but are not required to consider fire as a load condition in structural design. Fire protection engineers design the active fire protection systems in a building, such as sprinklers, smoke alarms, and fire alarms and smoke management systems.